When life brings us face to face with the people who have hurt us the most, it is difficult to predict how we will react. Italo spent his entire life carrying the pain and contempt of his father, Jorge, like an impossible burden to bear. Years of rejection and cruelty have hardened Italo's heart, turning the love he once sought into bitterness. But fate, always unpredictable, brought Italo a unique opportunity to confront his feelings when Jorge, after a serious car accident, was on the verge of death, in a coma. During one of his visits to the hospital, Italo, in the midst of a storm of emotions, felt the need to confess to his father the most difficult words he had ever uttered. "I hoped you would die in that accident." And now, faced with a man who could not respond, Italo was forced to confront the complexity of his own heart. Was it possible to forgive a father who never gave him the love he so desired? Italo grew up in a home where love seemed to be a distant, almost non-existent concept. From the moment he came into the world, he was seen by his father, Jorge, as the cause of the greatest tragedy of his life, the death of his wife during childbirth. This devastating loss turned Jorge into a bitter man, unable to deal with the pain that consumed him. And, unfortunately, this pain was directed at his own son, Italo, who grew up feeling the weight of contempt in every look and every word that Jorge spoke to him. Italo's childhood was marked by this toxic relationship, where paternal love was replaced by silent but constantly present resentment. Jorge, unable to overcome his grief, projected all his frustration and anger onto Italo. He saw his son as responsible for taking away the woman he loved so much from him, and this perception poisoned any possibility of a connection between them. For Italo, every day was an emotional battle, where the simple desire to be loved and accepted by his father was constantly crushed by harsh words and cold gestures. Instead of receiving support and guidance, Italo was treated with indifference or, worse, open contempt. This created in the boy a feeling of profound isolation, as if he were condemned to carry a guilt that he could never atone for. The absence of paternal affection caused Italo to become an introspective and insecure child. While the other children were happy with their parents' support, Italo closed himself off in his own world, trying to understand why his father hated him so much. He wondered silently if there was something wrong with him, if he was, in fact, the cause of all of Jorge's unhappiness. This constant doubt eroded his self-esteem and shaped his personality in painful ways. But, despite all the pain, Italo did not allow resentment to grow in his heart in the same way it had grown in Jorge's. In the midst of this hostile environment, Italo found solace in the company of his Aunt Hilda, Jorge's sister. Hilda, although also marked by the suffering of seeing her brother sink into bitterness, never let this affect her relationship with Italo. On the contrary, she made a point of being the loving figure that was missing in the boy's life. It was with her that Italo shared his small joys and sadness, and it was from her that he received the affection he so desired. But, even with all Hilda's affection, Italo was unable to fill the void left by his father's rejection. The years passed, and the emotional distance between Italo and Jorge only increased. Italo, who was now beginning to better understand the dynamics of that relationship, sought to move away from the oppression he felt at home. He dedicated himself to his studies with an intensity that surprised everyone, as if in books he could find the escape he so desired. But every time he tried to take a step towards independence, Jorge found a way to pull him back, to reaffirm his control over his son. The relationship between them seemed to be at an impasse, until an unexpected event changed everything. Hilda has always been the silent pillar in Italo's life, offering him the love and support he sorely lacked from his father. Since Italo's childhood, she took on the role of substitute mother, trying to compensate for the coldness and contempt that Jorge showed towards his son. Hilda saw in Italo a sensitive child, who, despite everything, still longed for his father's love. She did her best to fill that gap, giving him attention, affection, and, above all, understanding. His house, which was just a few blocks from where Jorge and Italo lived, became a safe haven for the boy, a place where he could be himself, without the weight of guilt or rejection. Hilda's relationship with Jorge, however, was complex. She always loved her brother, but that love was marked by deep pain. Since Jorge lost his wife, Hilda has tried to be by his side, helping him deal with his grief. However, Jorge, consumed by grief, never recognized Hilda's support. He distanced himself from everyone, including her, and, over time, their relationship deteriorated. Hilda, who secretly had feelings for Jorge, suffered in silence when she saw how he closed himself off from the world and, even worse, how he transferred his bitterness to Italo. Even so, Hilda never gave up trying to reach her brother's heart. In his most vulnerable moments, Italo often took refuge in Hilda's house. She welcomed him with open arms, always with a kind smile and a word of comfort. It was with Hilda that Italo talked about his dreams, his frustrations, and his fears. She listened patiently, offering advice and encouragement. Hilda believed in Italo's potential and always encouraged him to continue his studies, to fight for a better life, despite the difficulties he faced at home. For Italo, these conversations were like a balm, alleviating, even if temporarily, the pain he felt on a daily basis. Hilda also tried, in every way, to soften the relationship between Jorge and Italo. She organized family dinners, trying to create moments of harmony, in the hope that Jorge would finally see the value of his son. However, their efforts rarely bore fruit. Jorge, still trapped in his cycle of guilt and resentment, rejected any attempt to get closer. This deeply saddened Hilda, who saw the potential of a united family being destroyed by Jorge's inability to forgive himself and his son. But despite the frustrations, Hilda never gave up believing that, one day, Jorge and Italo could reconcile. Over the years, Hilda became Italo's emotional anchor, the person he could trust completely. She represented the possibility of a different future, where love and respect could prevail over pain and bitterness. However, Hilda also knew that for this to happen, something needed to change. Jorge needed to confront his own demons, and Italo needed to find the strength to forgive, even without having received the love he so desired. And it was with this hope that Hilda continued to support Italo, believing that, somehow, destiny would lead them to the redemption they so needed. As Italo grew up, his desire for independence became more and more intense. He knew that to escape Jorge's oppressive control, he would need to walk his own path, away from his father's shadow. From a young age, Italo demonstrated remarkable intelligence, and studies became his main outlet. He stood out at school, not just for his grades, but for the dedication with which he applied himself to each task. Italo saw education as a way out, an opportunity to build a different life, away from the toxic environment that imprisoned him at home. Jorge, however, did not view his son's efforts favorably. For him, the idea of Italo distancing himself and following in his own footsteps was unacceptable. Instead of supporting his son's ambitions, Jorge did his best to make his life difficult. He criticized Italo's studies, was dismissive of his academic achievements and, whenever possible, placed obstacles in his path. On several occasions, Jorge even prevented Italo from participating in important school activities, claiming that they were a waste of time. For Jorge, Italo should conform to the destiny he had set out for him. A destiny that, in Jorge's mind, did not include the independence that Italo so longed for. But Italo was resilient. Jorge's every attempt to control him only strengthened his resolve. He started spending more time in the library, studying late, to make up for what he couldn't do at home. Teachers noticed Italo's potential and, realizing the difficulties he faced, began to offer him extra support, recommending books, scholarship opportunities, and counseling. Italo took advantage of every opportunity with gratitude, aware that these small gestures could make all the difference in his future. In his quest for independence, Italo also began working small jobs, hidden from Jorge. He knew he would need money to finance his education and eventually free himself from his father's control. These works, although modest, taught Italo the value of effort and self-sufficiency. Every penny he earned was carefully saved, with the dream of one day being able to support himself without depending on Jorge. For Italo, these small steps toward independence were a way of asserting his identity, of showing himself that he was more than a reflection of his father's expectations. However, Italo's fight for independence was not just an external battle against the restrictions imposed by Jorge, it was also an internal battle. He knew that to truly free himself, he would need to overcome the resentment and pain he carried because of his father. Italo wanted more than just to physically distance himself from Jorge. He wanted to free himself emotionally, to find a place of peace where the past could no longer hurt him. But, as he fought for this freedom, Italo could not predict that destiny would bring him even greater challenges, forcing him to confront once and for all the shadows of the past that he so wanted to leave behind. Fate sometimes has a cruel way of interrupting the plans we carefully make for our lives. For Italo, the day he received the news of his father, Jorge's serious car accident, was one of those moments. The phone call came in the early hours of the morning, breaking the silence of the night and bringing with it a feeling of uncertainty and fear. Jorge had suffered an accident while returning home, and his condition was critical. The initial shock left Italo paralyzed. Despite all the bitterness and resentment he felt towards his father, the idea of losing him so suddenly brought up a complex mix of emotions that he was not prepared to face. Jorge was rushed to the hospital, where doctors fought to save his life. The injuries were serious and the prognosis was uncertain. Italo, upon arriving at the hospital, found his Aunt Hilda already present, her face marked by concern. The tension between them was palpable. Despite everything, Jorge was still Hilda's brother, and the possibility of losing him was painful for her. Italo, on the other hand, found himself in a whirlwind of feelings. On the one hand, the anger and resentment he had harbored for years was still there, but on the other, the fragility of the situation made him question whether he really wanted to see his father leave without a last word, without a chance at redemption. While waiting for news from the doctors, Italo and Hilda began to reflect on what could have caused the accident. Jorge, although he was a man with many flaws, was always careful behind the wheel. The hypothesis that the accident could have been caused by some type of negligence seemed unlikely. It was then that the first suspicions arose. What if the accident had not been a mere chance? What if something darker was behind it? These questions began to torment Italo, who, despite everything, felt that there was something wrong with the way everything had happened. In the following days, while Jorge remained in a coma, Hilda began to discreetly investigate the circumstances of the accident. She knew that Jorge had enemies in the business world, but the extent of this enmity was still unknown. The idea that someone could have deliberately caused the accident to get rid of Jorge began to gain strength in his mind. Hilda shared her suspicions with Italo, who was initially reluctant to believe that something so horrible could be true. However, growing evidence that the accident was no simple accident began to erode his doubts. As new information emerged, it became clear that Jorge had been the victim of an assassination attempt. The shock of this revelation shook Italo deeply. The man he had hated for so many years was now seen in a new light, that of a victim of an evil conspiracy. For Italo, this changed everything. He knew that, despite everything, he couldn't let his father's life be taken in such a cowardly way. And so, while Jorge remained unconscious, Italo and Hilda decided that they would do everything to discover the truth and ensure that those responsible were brought to justice. With the suspicion that Jorge's accident was not just a fatality, Hilda dove head first into her own investigation. She knew that Jorge, in his business career, had accumulated both allies and enemies, but she never imagined that someone could be so audacious as to try to assassinate him. Hilda began searching Jorge's papers, his contracts, agreements, and correspondence, looking for any clue that could indicate a greater conflict. It was during this search that she found a series of documents that shed light on the true extent of Jorge's problems that he had hidden even from her. Among the papers, Hilda discovered that Jorge had a partner, Gabriel, with whom he had founded his company years ago. At first glance, Gabriel appeared to be a trustworthy business partner, but the evidence contained in the documents told a different story. Hilda found records of suspicious bank transfers, altered contracts, and, most disturbingly, correspondence where Gabriel appeared to maneuver to take full control of the company. It was evident that Gabriel was involved in illegal activities and that he had used Jorge as a pawn in his schemes, until he finally decided to eliminate him to ensure his own success. As Hilda and Italo pieced together this dark puzzle, the extent of the conspiracy became increasingly clear. Gabriel had engineered Jorge's accident as part of a meticulously crafted plan to take control of the company. He knew that with Jorge out of the picture, there would be no one to stop him from carrying out his plans. The discovery of this betrayal deeply shook Hilda and Italo. For Hilda, it was a double pain, not only for the attempted murder of her brother, but also for the fact that she had trusted Gabriel for so long, without realizing the danger he posed. Italo, in turn, felt a mixture of anger and guilt. Anger that Gabriel had dared to try to kill his father, and guilt for never having suspected that something so serious was happening. He knew that Jorge, despite all his faults, did not deserve such a cruel fate. The discovery of the conspiracy brought to light the urgent need to act. Italo and Hilda decided that they could not stand by while Gabriel continued to roam freely, possibly planning other attacks to ensure the success of his plot. They needed to expose Gabriel and make sure he paid for his crimes. With the truth now revealed, Italo and Hilda began to plan their next steps. They knew they would need to gather more evidence to take the case to the police and ensure that Gabriel was arrested. But they also knew it wouldn't be easy. Gabriel was cunning and dangerous, and any mistake could cost them dearly. The pressure on them increased every day, especially with Jorge still in a coma, unable to defend himself or help. However, Italo and Hilda were determined to bring Gabriel to justice, not only to avenge what he had done to Jorge, but also to stop him from causing any more harm. With Jorge still in a coma and Gabriel's conspiracy slowly coming to light, Italo felt consumed by a storm of emotions. However, amid all the tension and the effort to gather evidence against Gabriel, an unexpected discovery at the hospital brought to the surface feelings that Italo was not prepared to face. During one of his daily visits to his father, while waiting in the silent room filled only with the sound of medical equipment, Italo noticed an envelope on the nightstand next to Jorge's bed. The paper was worn, indicating that it had been handled several times. Italo's curiosity led him to open the envelope, revealing a letter written by Jorge himself. As Italo read his father's words, an avalanche of emotions hit him. In the letter, Jorge spoke of his love for Italo, a love that he had never been able to express in words or gestures due to the pain he carried over his wife's death. Jorge admitted that, for years, he blamed himself for the death of the woman he loved and, in his grief, transferred that blame unfairly to his son. He acknowledged that he had treated Italo in a cruel and cold way, but at the same time, he revealed that this treatment was not the result of hatred, but of a deep inability to deal with his own demons. For Italo, reading that letter was devastating and redemptive at the same time. Jorge's words didn't erase the scars left by years of rejection and contempt, but they offered a glimpse of the truth Italo always wanted to hear, that, despite everything, his father loved him. Jorge confessed in the letter that, even when he was tough and distant, he always worried about Italo and that, in his loneliest moments, he wished he could go back in time and be the father that Italo deserved. He acknowledged that he had failed in many aspects, but made it clear that, if given a second chance, he would do everything differently. The letter ended with Jorge asking Italo for forgiveness, saying that, if anything happened to him, he wanted his son to know that he loved him more than anything in the world. Italo, when he finished reading, felt torn between the pain of all the words never said and the relief of finally knowing that his father didn't hate him as he always believed. It was as if a weight he had carried all his life had been partially lifted, but there was still a lot to be resolved. The letter was a catalyst for Italo, making him realize that, despite all the suffering, there was still room for forgiveness and reconciliation, as long as Jorge survived. Italo, with tears in his eyes, held Jorge's inert hand. For a moment, he wished his father could wake up, that they could have the chance to talk about everything that was in the past, to rebuild a relationship that never had the opportunity to blossom. But for now, all Italo could do was wait and fight to make sure Jorge had the chance to wake up. The discovery of the letter, while bringing emotional relief, also strengthened Italo's resolve to ensure that Gabriel was arrested. He knew that to achieve the peace and redemption he so desired, He would need to face danger head-on and protect his father's life at all costs. With Jorge's letter still echoing in his mind and the weight of the most recent revelations, Italo remained vigilant. He knew that Gabriel, realizing that his plans were at risk, could take desperate measures. However, even knowing the danger, Italo was not prepared for what happened the night that followed. As he and Hilda took turns visiting the hospital, a feeling of restlessness began to wash over them both. Hilda, always attentive, noticed something strange around the hospital. Suspicious movements that, although subtle, did not go unnoticed by her attentive gaze. That night, Hilda decided to stay at the hospital until later, feeling that something was about to happen. And her suspicions were confirmed when, in the middle of the night, she saw a familiar figure approaching Jorge's room. It was Gabriel, and he was far from being there out of compassion. With a determined and furtive look, he entered Jorge's room, without realizing that Hilda was watching him from afar. Hilda, her heart racing, knew she couldn't let Gabriel act with impunity, but she also knew she needed to be careful. Without hesitation, she ran to tell Italo, who was just a few minutes away from the hospital. Gabriel, unaware that he was being watched, approached Jorge's bed, with clear intentions of forever silencing the only man who could still threaten his plans. He brought with him a syringe, apparently prepared to administer a lethal dose of medication. The hospital environment, usually peaceful at that hour, now seemed permeated with tension. Gabriel, with his hands shaking but his gaze determined, was about to inject the substance into Jorge's intravenous line when the bedroom door opened abruptly. Italo and Hilda entered the room, taking Gabriel by surprise. What followed was a tense confrontation. Gabriel, cornered, tried to hide it, claiming he was there to check on Jorge's health, but the syringe in his hand and the look of panic on his face betrayed him. Italo, driven by anger and desperation to protect his father, confronted Gabriel directly, demanding that he explain his actions. Gabriel, realizing he had been discovered, tried to escape, but Hilda had already alerted hospital security, who quickly arrived to prevent his escape. The scene, charged with emotion, was the culmination of a conspiracy that almost cost Jorge his life. Gabriel was arrested right there, in the hospital, with all the evidence pointing to his guilt. As he was taken away by authorities, Italo allowed himself to feel a moment of relief. But the relief was mixed with deep sadness. What could have happened if Hilda hadn't been there? The idea of losing his father before they could reconcile was unbearable for Italo. He approached Jorge, still unconscious, holding his hand firmly. The danger had passed, but the battle for justice and redemption was not yet complete. Italo knew that, as long as Jorge remained in a coma, he would have to bear the weight of everything that had happened alone. Gabriel's arrest in the hospital marked the beginning of the end for the web of conspiracies he had woven over the years. After the failed attempt to assassinate Jorge, Gabriel was taken into custody, and a formal investigation was quickly launched by authorities. Italo, who had spent so long in the shadow of his father and his business, now found himself at the center of a scandal that had the potential to destroy everything that was left of the family company. Determined to ensure that Gabriel paid for his crimes, Italo dedicated himself to collaborating with the police, providing all the information and evidence that he and Hilda had gathered. During interrogations, Gabriel tried to dodge the accusations, but the evidence against him was irrefutable. Documents, suspicious bank transactions, compromising emails. Everything pointed to his attempt to take control of the company and eliminate Jorge to ensure his plan was successful. Gabriel, faced with the possibility of a long prison sentence, finally gave in to pressure and began to reveal the details of his plot. He confessed that, over the years, he had diverted company funds to personal accounts, using complex money laundering schemes to hide his activities. Jorge, although he suspected wrongdoing, never had the chance to discover the extent of what was happening until it was too late. Gabriel's trial attracted significant media attention, especially for the shocking nature of the conspiracy. Italo and Hilda followed the process closely, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness as the truth was publicly revealed. During the trial, it became clear that Gabriel did not act alone. He had accomplices within the company, people he bribed or coerced to facilitate his illegal activities. These accomplices were also brought to justice, and the network of corruption that Gabriel had created was dismantled. For Italo, seeing Gabriel's downfall was a bitter victory. He knew that, despite everything, the damage to his father's reputation and the company was irreversible. While Gabriel faced his fate, Italo and Hilda turned their attention to Jorge's recovery. The hospital confrontation had been a turning point, but there was still a long way to go. Italo, who had spent years trying to distance himself from his father's legacy, now found himself in the position of saving him, not just physically, but morally as well. He knew that in order for Jorge to fully recover, both physically and emotionally, he would need to face the consequences of his past actions and try to make amends for what was still possible. With Gabriel finally out of the picture, the company began the difficult process of rebuilding. Italo, with Hilda's support, took an active role in managing the business, determined to restore the integrity that had been lost. Gabriel's arrest brought a sense of justice, but it also marked the beginning of a new challenge for Italo, that of reconnecting with his father and working together to rebuild both the company and their relationship. And while Jorge remained in a coma, Italo knew that the real work of healing would only begin when his father finally woke up. With Gabriel arrested and the immediate threat removed, Italo and Hilda turned their attention to Jorge's recovery and the complex task of rebuilding the family relationship that had been destroyed over the years. The time Jorge spent in a coma was a kind of limbo for Italo, a period in which he was forced to confront all the emotions he had repressed for so long: anger, hurt, and a deep pain at never having experienced the paternal love that I wanted so much. But at the same time, the letter he found in the hospital planted a seed of hope in his heart, a desire that, if Jorge woke up, they could finally begin to heal the wounds of the past. When Jorge finally opened his eyes, weak and disoriented, Italo was at his side. Recovery was slow, and Jorge, still weak, seemed like a different man from the one Italo had known throughout his life. The near-death experience and time in a coma made Jorge more introspective, more aware of the choices he had made and the people he had pushed away. Italo's constant presence by his side during his recovery spoke louder than any words could express. Jorge realized that, despite everything, his son was there, willing to help him recover and, perhaps, rebuild the relationship they never had. The first days after Jorge's awakening were full of suppressed emotions and unspoken dialogues. Hilda, always patient, mediated interactions between the two, offering support and encouragement. She knew that both Italo and Jorge needed time to adjust to this new reality, a reality in which they were both willing to try to reconcile, despite the scars of the past. Little by little, conversations began to flow. Italo, overcoming his pride and accumulated pain, began to talk about his childhood, about the feelings he had kept for years, and about the impact that Jorge's contempt had on his life. Jorge, in turn, listened in silence, absorbing every word, every confession, aware that he was finally facing the consequences of his actions. Little by little, a new dynamic began to form between father and son. Jorge, who had always been tough and inflexible, began to open space for dialogue, trying to understand the son who, for so long, he had kept at a distance. Italo, on the other hand, began to see his father in a new light. Jorge's fragility, both physical and emotional, revealed a man who, behind the mask of rigidity, had suffered as much as he had. This did not justify the cruel treatment he had received, but it offered a path to forgiveness and reconciliation. Hilda, who always believed in the potential for a healthy relationship between Jorge and Italo, saw her efforts finally begin to bear fruit. She was there every step of the way, helping guide conversations, offering advice, and, most of all, providing the emotional support they both needed. The reconstruction of the relationship between Jorge and Italo was a slow process, full of ups and downs, but also moments of mutual understanding and discoveries. The company, which had suffered so much from Gabriel's conspiracy, now became a symbol of resistance and renewal, just like the relationship between father and son. As Jorge regained his strength, he and Italo began working together at the company, with a new perspective. Experience taught them that power and control were not the most important elements in their lives. What really mattered was family, respect, and love that, even after years of pain and distance, could still be restored. And so, amidst challenges and uncertainties, Jorge and Italo began a new chapter in their lives, building together a future that, although marked by the past, was now full of possibilities for forgiveness and love. As time passed, the relationship between Jorge and Italo, previously marked by almost unbearable pain, began to transform into something unexpectedly beautiful. The journey to get to this point was long and full of challenges, but they both knew it was necessary to heal the wounds of the past. Jorge, now fully recovered, had become a more humble man and aware of the mistakes he made. He finally understood the weight of his actions and the consequences they had on Italo. With that, he committed to doing everything in his power to earn his son's forgiveness. Italo, in turn, found within himself the strength to forgive his father. He realized that holding on to resentment only prolonged the pain they both felt. The letter he discovered in the hospital had been the first step towards reconciliation, but it was the time they spent together after Jorge's recovery that solidified their forgiveness. Italo saw his father as a broken man, but willing to change, and this touched his heart deeply. Little by little, the space left by hatred was occupied by a feeling of compassion and understanding. Italo understood that, to move forward, he needed to leave the past behind and build something new alongside Jorge. With Hilda always by their side, Jorge and Italo not only rebuilt their relationship, but also strengthened the family ties that had been so fragile for years. Hilda, who had suffered in silence for so long, now saw the fruit of her patience and unconditional love. She was a key player in this process, offering not only support, but also an example of how love can resist time and adversity. The new family dynamic was also reflected in the company, which, under the joint leadership of Jorge and Italo, began to prosper again, this time with renewed values and unshakable ethics. The process of redemption was not only personal, but also public. Jorge decided to open his heart to the world, publicly acknowledging his mistakes and doing what he could to correct the past. He became involved in social projects, using his experience to help other entrepreneurs avoid the same mistakes he made. The company, which was previously just a business, became a platform for good, with part of the profits going to causes that promoted inclusion and support for families in difficulty. Italo, alongside his father, led these initiatives with passion, knowing that, like them, many other people needed a second chance. At the end of this journey, Jorge, Italo, and Hilda found themselves not only as survivors of a painful story, but as living examples that redemption is possible, even in the most difficult circumstances. They learned that forgiveness is not an isolated act, but an ongoing process that requires effort, understanding, and, above all, love. Together, they began to build a new future, where the past served only as a reminder that, even in the shadows, there is always a light waiting to be discovered. And so, the story of Jorge and Italo transformed from a narrative of pain into a story of hope, showing that, with time, patience, and will, any wound can be healed. Sometimes life puts us in situations that force us to confront our deepest, most painful emotions. Italo had to face years of pain to discover that, despite everything, forgiveness can be a source of redemption for both those who grant it and those who receive it. And you, is there someone in your life that you still haven't been able to forgive? What would it be like if, instead of carrying the weight of resentment, you chose the freedom that forgiveness can bring? If this story made you reflect on the complexities of family relationships and the transformative power of forgiveness, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Together, we can continue to explore stories that inspire us to be better and build bridges where there once were walls. Don't miss the chance to transform your own life. The next step is in your hands.